In this video, we're going to talk about the development of corporate governance. And to do this, we're going to lead in by a discussion of stakeholders and look at the importance of the various stakeholders, and then look at the accountability and the way in which corporations or businesses should deal with the various requirements of the stakeholders. So let's start by talking about stakeholders. First of all, we may divide stakeholders into internal and external categories. So we can separate out the stakeholders into these categories and classify them accordingly. We'll start with the external stakeholders. Well, here we could consider shareholders to be external because the shareholders are not involved, generally speaking, they're not involved routinely with the business. They're not involved day to day with the business, generally speaking. Some may be, but for large organizations, the shareholders may be pension fund managers or investors who are simply looking for a return on their investment, who are looking for security of investment. So they may not be involved in working with the business. They may not be involved day to day. So they're external. Debt holders are external. These are perhaps companies who have supplied raw materials or components to the business and were waiting to be paid. Trade creditors and suppliers. Again, companies or individuals who have supplied services to the business and who are waiting to receive payment. But also, they may also be regulars in supplying their facilities and their components or their services to the business. They may be regular in doing that, and as such they've got an interest in the business, so they become stakeholders. They're not just a one-off. They may be involved on a regular basis with the business in supplying their services or supplying components or raw materials or whatever it is. So they have a particular interest in the business. They are external stakeholders. Customers are interested in the business because they receive the product or the service from the business, and customers require that. So they're interested in the well-being of the business and in what the business is doing. But so also are the communities where the business is located. Businesses exist because society allows the businesses to exist. But there is a mutuality. Both sides benefit. The businesses make profit. The businesses supply goods and services and in return cover their costs and generate a surplus. And that's in the interest of the business. But the communities benefit also because the communities have employment within the businesses and the communities receive the goods and services that are produced by the businesses. But there's also other issues. The communities want or expect the businesses to behave in a responsible manner, to ensure that they're not polluting the air or the atmosphere or creating a nuisance within the communities. So there has to be some code of ethical behaviour that is, in a sense, agreed between the two parties, between the communities on the one side and the businesses on the other. There are also internal stakeholders. The board of directors are an obvious example. The board of directors may be appointed by the shareholders to monitor the activities of the various managers. We'll see later on when we talk about issues associated with the internal stakeholders more directly, particularly in the context of what we call the principal agent issues. We'll see that there's a differential in power between the managers and the shareholders. The shareholders, generally speaking, don't know a lot about the business. They don't know about the products or the research or the corporate strategy perhaps, or they don't understand the terms of delivery for raw materials or components or sources. So shareholders, generally speaking, are not very well versed in the running of the business, whereas the managers are. So there is differential power between the managers and the shareholders. Managers, generally speaking, have a lot more power, but the managers may abuse that power. We'll talk about this later, but the managers may abuse the power. And to stop that abuse, the shareholders sometimes appoint a board of directors who are there to try to ensure that there is fairness throughout the organisation, and in particular fairness in terms of the dealings of the managers with the shareholders. The shareholders, after all, are the owners of the business. But another internal stakeholder, just to complete our list here, is management and also, of course, the employees. So these are internal stakeholders. They've got a big interest in the well-being of the business and in the way in which the business conducts itself. Now, I mentioned earlier the principal agent issue. Now, this is one of the big issues that we need to deal with in the context of corporate governance. However, before I get into that, can I just say that a lot of this is developed from economic theory. The past literature was based on economics, and in particular on the type of economics that is taught at colleges and universities throughout the world. So it's based on ideas associated with the theory of the firm. Economists are interested in trying to work out what was efficiency within firms, what was the efficiency of organizations, and how could the efficiency of organizations be improved, or what are the criteria upon which efficiency could be measured. And the original model put forward was one called profit maximization. And this actually dates back to I think it's to the 1800s, possibly 1700s. I think it was developed by a French economist called Augustin Cournot. And essentially what the neoclassical model of profit maximization states is that companies should maximize profits, and that occurs when marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. There are two other conditions. The marginal revenue should exceed average variable cost, and yet another one saying that the marginal cost should be upward sloping, as it's called. But generally speaking, marginal revenue equals marginal cost, and we associate that with profit maximization. Quite an extreme model. It says that companies are there to maximize profits, which of course we know is not really what happens in the world. Companies have all sorts of complex requirements. Companies may want to achieve other ends. But economists had to start somewhere, so they started with profit maximization. In fact, they went on to develop a whole plethora of models. The growth of sales model, the sales maximization hypothesis, the growth of the firm hypothesis. There are many models in economics, in economic theory, that students of economics will have studied, that will give different perspectives about what companies are attempting to do. From our perspective, we look at companies as very complex organizations. A lot of the outcomes that we experience in practice from companies are the product of negotiations between the various stakeholders and the management of the business, and also negotiations between various levels of management who are trying to find the best solution for themselves and for the company. But all of this started off a much bigger debate, and this is sometimes referred to as the principal agent issue, or the principal agent debate. Here we can see the company as composed of, in a sense, two sets of people. One, the principals, The principals are essentially the owners. These are the shareholders, the owners of the business. And on the other side, the agents. And the agents are the managers. And there is a conflict of interest here. The management want different outcomes to the shareholders. The shareholders, and we'll see this later in one of the slides, I'm just preempting it slightly here, but the shareholders want security of investment and they want a high return on their investment. That's why they put their money into the business. That's why they invested in the business. That's what these shareholders want. But the agents, the management in other words, they want security of employment. They don't want the company to be taken over by rivals. But they also want high salaries, good working conditions, bonuses. And the more the management take for themselves, the less there is for the principals, for the owners. So there is a conflict between the two. And that's the problem that the principal agent issue addresses. To a large extent, corporate governance is concerned with dealing with conflicts between stakeholders and trying to ensure ethical behaviour in business. So it's trying to deal with the conflict between the stakeholders. In this case, our stakeholders could be the management on the one side and the shareholders on the other. That's a conflict, as I just said. And it's trying to ensure ethical behaviour. There's no cheating. There's no subterfuge. There's no hiding facts or intentions. There's an openness. The separation of ownership from control, as I said, which really develops within the economics literature, but now has gone much wider. The literature on economics has discussed the problem of owner-manager relations for many years, and is now seen as more important than a mere academic issue. Now it's seen as very important in a very practical way. In fact, economics have provided the framework for the subsequent discussion in the form of principal-agent discussion framework. So we can trace this back to the economics literature, but now it's widely debated in all sorts of areas, in management, in business, literature, in law. It's disputed and developed and argued over in many different areas. Typically in large firms there is a separation of ownership from the control of the business. In bigger firms, obviously in small firms, the owners will be involved with the management of the small firm. But in large firms, perhaps with many hundreds or even thousands of workers, there will be a separation of ownership from control. There will be one set of people who own the business, the shareholders, and there will be another set of people, the managers, who will control the business. So there are two sides, management on the one side and, if you like, the owners on the other side. So there's a separation of ownership from control. Ownership is usually split between a large number of shareholders, whereas management power may be focused in the hands of a few managers. Now we're getting closer towards the real problem. The shareholders are quite dispersed. They're separated. For large companies with flotations on the stock market, there may be many thousands of shareholders, some of them holding very few shares. So they don't get involved. They're simply just waiting to see how the company's doing, what the share value is, and what their dividends are. But they're not involved in the business. Whereas management are involved. And management will structure themselves, perhaps hierarchically, with a senior manager and then middle management and then line management, or departmental management and line management and so on. There'll be some sort of structure. And they also have expert knowledge of the business. They know about the business. They know about the supply of raw materials and components, and the technicalities of production and distribution and research and development and corporate strategy. They know about the business. So now we have two sides: shareholders, who are very weak individually, and managers, who are very focused and concentrated and are very powerful and very knowledgeable. The principal agent problem arises when upper and controlling management, the agents in our scheme, they have different goals and considerable power in the form of information than the shareholders, if you like, the principals. So the managers are concentrated and have a lot of information, technical information about the business. The shareholders are weak because they're so separated out. They might hold small shareholdings, and there may be many of them, so they don't act together. They're not united. They don't present a united front to challenge the management. From this perspective, corporations may be seen as engaging in continuous power struggles between the owners, the shareholders, and the managers. So when we see organizations, large companies, the chances are there are battles being fought, battles between the shareholders and battles between the shareholders and the managers, and also between different layers of management. The managers may not be driven by profitability or growth goals. Managers are not driven entirely by profitability or growth goals. The managers may want to secure their future, and in so doing wish to have the business as profitable, and certainly they may not want the business to be taken over by a competitor, which could happen if profitability falls. Then share prices will fall and the business may become vulnerable and perhaps being taken over by a competitor. So the managers have an interest in profitability, but it may not be primal. It may not be the central focus. They may have their own ambitions about their salaries, their conditions of employment, their cars, their holidays, and all the perks they can get from the business. The board of directors may have to side with the demands of management rather than the interest of shareholders, the owners. The managers have expert knowledge. They know the business, they know the suppliers, they know the technology, they know the course that the business is on, which direction it's moving in. They know the personnel within the business and their skills and competencies. So the board of directors are in a weakened position. They can deal with the management, but to a large extent they must go along with what the management ask, because it's the management who, in a sense, the management run the business, and they run it entirely. The board of directors monitor the managers, deal with the managers, and become involved. But it's difficult for the board of managers to act on the part of the shareholders and represent the shareholders wholeheartedly. They must also deal with the management. So shareholder requirements are high dividends. That's what the shareholders would like to see. They've invested in the business and they would like to see a high return on their investments. They would also like to see corporate growth through investment. They would like to see the business growing so that their dividends will prosper and grow even further in the future. But they'd also like to see security of investment. They'd like to see their investments not to be vulnerable or to display any uncertainty or risk. They like to have the idea that their investment is solid. It's a good investment. They're not going to lose their investment. So they want to have security. The management, well, their requirements could be sufficient dividends to maintain the share value of the business and prevent takeover. So the management must ensure that the share price is maintained and that the shareholders are happy. The shareholders must be content with what they're getting and not try to sell their shares and perhaps in that way leave the business open for takeover. If it is taken over, the management may suffer. The new owners may bring in their own management or a new set of management. But also the management like to see high managerial salaries and bonuses. They like to be well paid and have many perks, perhaps company cars and business trips, and so they like to be rewarded. So the perks, the cars, the hospitality, health care, they like to have these because it also shows their status, but it's a part of their remuneration. So you can see from the two sets that there are conflicting requirements on both parties, or between the both parties. The shareholders want one set and the management want a different set. Now, corporate governance is a way of bridging the principal-agent problem and ensuring full disclosure and ethical behaviour. And that's what corporate governance, I should say, is trying to do. Corporate governance is about intervening to try and get both sides to deal with each other and to act in a way which is proper, it's ethical, and there's full disclosure, there's no secrecy or there's no cheating or attempt at hiding facts. It's openness. Abuses by corporate management that undervalues the corporation to the detriment of the shareholders and leads to risk to the detriment of the various stakeholders are the focus of corporate governance. That's what corporate governance is about. It's about trying to get the management, the corporate management, to act in ways which are fair and open and decent, and this various stakeholders, the employees, the suppliers, all the various stakeholders, including the shareholders, know what's happening within the business. Clearly, there may be issues involving security of information and secrecy to be held back from the prying eyes of the competitors. But as far as possible, it should be the case that the key stakeholders in the business should be aware of what's happening within the business and should trust the management. Now, there are some key reports on corporate governance that we should be aware of. For a start, the Cadbury report in the UK in 1992, the principles of corporate governance. This is when Adrian Cadbury reported, was commissioned and reported on corporate governance. In America, the Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002, which followed on from the Cadbury report, also known as Sarbox or SOX. This is an effort on the part of the federal government in the US to legislate parts of the Cadbury report, but also another report by the OECD, the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development. So there was throughout the 90s there was more and more talk about corporate governance and the need for corporate governance, and these reports came out, and then governments tried to incorporate the findings of the reports into requirements for company reporting. Essentially, bear in mind, it was an attempt to try and bridge the gulf between the principals and the agents, between the owners of the business on the one side and the managers on the other, to ensure that there was disclosure between the two. The Cadbury and Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD reports were followed up with various other reports, the 2004 and 2015 reports. So it was an emerging area of concern and an emerging area of research and inquiry. And as I said, it was more and more taken into account by governments and legislators to try and incorporate findings and the findings of the reports and the recommendations of the reports and incorporate those into legislation. So these outlines the general principles around which businesses are expected to operate to reassure or to assure, I should say, proper governance. So these outlines were more and more talked about, became more and more important. And what they were was simply recognizing the gulf, the problem of corporate governance, and making sure that the businesses were aligned between the requirements of the shareholders on the one hand and the various stakeholders, and also the requirements of management. So he was trying to get all sides, in a sense, to pull together. Now the general principles, well, rights and equitable treatment of shareholders. Now the rights of shareholders should be respected. Better sharing of corporate information and more shareholder involvement. So the reports recommended that shareholders should be respected. The shareholders are the owners of the business. They're the ones who invested in the business, who grew the business, who perhaps invested at the start of the business. And it was felt that they should be treated properly and openly. They should be given the facts openly and clearly so that they know what's happening. And they should be treated equitably, fairly. But also there are interests of other stakeholders. Corporations have legal, contractual, social and market-driven obligations to non-shareholder stakeholders, including employees, investors, creditors, suppliers, local communities, customers and policymakers. So organisations don't exist in a vacuum. Organisations must incorporate the views of various stakeholders and the requirements of various stakeholders, and must act in a way which is fair and open and decent towards the various stakeholders. So it's getting management to see the corporation not as their empire, but as a means of production, a means of wealth creation, but which is also openly shared with the various stakeholders, that these various stakeholders know what's happening and they can plan their lives accordingly. Employees should know that their jobs are secure and how well the business is going and how well it's doing, so that they can plan their personal lives. They can get mortgages and buy houses or whatever it is they have in mind. So it's trying to deal with the shareholders, having them treated fairly and equitably, but also the various stakeholders. And also the role and responsibilities of the board. Processes to challenge management should be put in place. The management need to be accountable. Management need to explain why they're pursuing certain policies and why they're doing things in a certain way. The board of directors need to have appropriate skills and independence to challenge management. The board of directors can't be from management. They must be capable of understanding what management is doing. They must have the skills and the abilities and the competencies. But they also must be independent from management so as to challenge the management and inquire into what the management are doing and why they're doing it the way they are, and what are the processes. And this is a way of checking for abuse, checking for waste, or perhaps ensuring that the management are not acquiring too many of the resources, too much of the surplus for themselves, and wastefully spending it. The surplus, after all, has been generated to grow the business, to secure the business, and also to reward the shareholders, to reward the owners. Integrity and ethical behaviour. There should be constant scrutiny of the integrity of corporate officers. A strong code of conduct should be instituted to promote ethical and responsible decision making. It's important that the management are simply not allowed to, in a sense, become corrupt, to, as I suggested on the previous point, not to start acquiring resources or taking part of the surplus, part of the profits of the business and using it for their own purpose. They are there to be rewarded by salary, not to, in a sense, steal the profits or to waste resources and thereby eat into profits. It's their obligation to be efficient. It's their obligation to run the business appropriately, efficiently. And if they don't do that, it's wrong. And that needs to be both discovered and checked. And there must be a board of directors in place who have the power, the authority, and the knowledge, the detailed knowledge, to check what is happening and to ensure that it's not being abused. Disclosure and transparency. So our final point here is disclosure and transparency. This is the roles, the levels of accountability and responsibility of board members and management should be made known to stakeholders. The company's financial reporting should be independently verified to safeguard the integrity of the process. So the various roles within the company, the various roles of management and the levels of accountability, who's responsible for what, and their responsibilities in terms of getting the job done and also of stewardship, of looking after the assets of the business, looking after the business and making sure that it's run properly. These should be made known to the stakeholders. Who is in charge? Who's in charge of certain areas? Who does what? So that if there is a breakdown, then the chain of command, the line of command can be traced back to some manager who can then be questioned about what happened and why did that particular facility break down or not function or let the company down. And of course the company's accounts should be independently verified. If they're not independently verified, again it's open to cheating, it's open to abuse. So professional accountants should check the financial reports of the business, and they should be checked and signed off by professional accountants who are responsible individuals with credentials from reputable accounting bodies and who will verify the true nature of the accounts and the accuracy of the accounts. So when we talk about corporate governance, these are the sort of the issues that we are considering. It's an important topic. It's one that is easy to forget about and not deal with, maybe because it only really started in the early 90s to be treated in a very serious manner. But the events over the early years of this millennium suggest, if anything, the need for corporate governance is stronger today than it was even back in the 90s. There's more need to watch payments within the banking system with large bonuses every year, and yet the banks going bankrupt and going out of business, and but also looking at large corporations and the responsibility of the large organizations, and yet the way the large organizations can easily let down the stakeholders. For example, perhaps misusing pension funds for other purposes. And that has happened. So that's all we're going to deal with in this session. It's an interesting session in the sense that it's a very important session. It's one that should be borne in mind at all times, and particularly when we're looking at accountancy It's important to note that when we do look at accounts or a set of accounts, we need to have confidence that those figures are accurate. The figures are fairly reported and they're not hiding other facts. It should be done openly. And businesses should be run in the full knowledge that there are owners who have rights and should be treated fairly. There are stakeholders, workers, the community, suppliers and so on, who should be treated fairly, as well as the managers, and they should be treated fairly as well. But one side should not abuse the others, or should not be in a position to abuse their power. So that's all we're going to deal with. Let's leave it at that and say thank you for watching.